Welcome to the program. It's long been one of the most difficult and emotional debates in this country, how to deal with asylum seekers who arrive on our shores. Well, now Labor has found itself in what, for at least now, appears to be a hopeless situation, trying to revive its Malaysian solution that was knocked out by the High Court last week, but neither the Greens nor the Coalition willing to help them out. To look at this issue and what else has been happening politically over the past week, we're joined by the Human Services Minister Tanya Plibersek, Tim Wilson from the Institute of Public Affairs, the former New South Wales Premier Christina Keneally, and the Shadow Minister for Disabilities, Senator Mitch Fifield. Welcome to you all. Let's start with asylum seekers. Tanya Plibersek, do you support offshore processing still?
Well, I think that we've made a very strong case that offshore processing will act as a deterrent to people smugglers. It is very important to discourage people from making what is an incredibly dangerous journey across the sea.
But many of your colleagues in the left of the Labor Party disagree with that. They want to see the national platform of the Labor Party upheld, which is only onshore processing.
Well, I think everybody agrees that we need to have a compassionate approach to dealing with asylum seekers. I think there is some disagreement about whether allowing people to make what is a very dangerous journey across the seas is indeed the compassionate approach.
So how widespread then is this view that you should only have onshore processing?
Certainly there are people within the Labor Party and within the community who believe that. I think if there is however, if people do make that journey and there are further terrible tragedies like we saw off the shores of Christmas Island, that's really not in anybody's interests. It's certainly not something that people in the Labor Party or in the community are prepared to see.
You need some sort of offshore processing is the bottom line.
Well, we think that offshore processing is a strong message to people smugglers that they won't have a product to sell to very vulnerable people.
Christina Keneally, is this a view shared, do you think, across the Labor Party?
I think Tanya's point is right. There are people in the Labor Party who strongly believe we should only have onshore processing. There are people in the Labor Party who understand the position that Tanya and the Prime Minister are putting, that we need to have a deterrent that stops people from making a very dangerous journey. All that being said, the Prime Minister has a short-term problem, which is to respond to the High Court challenge, or the High Court case decision, and she needs a legislative solution to that. She's doing the right thing, in my view, by going back to the Parliament, seeking to make Tony Abbott act in the national interest or expose him politically when he doesn't. There is a longer-term issue here, though, for the Labor Party, and whether we have ceded too much ground over the last decade on this debate to the Conservatives. At the end of the day, we're talking about...
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
I think we're conducting this debate for the last decade on John Howard's terms still. And, we're talking about 6,000 or so at its peak desperate people who have a legal right to seek asylum in this country, seeking to exercise that right. And I think as a nation, and I think as a party, we believe that we are big enough culturally, economically, geographically, we have enough heart to welcome those people.
And is Labor not doing enough to argue that at the moment, to say, look, get it in context, it's not that big a problem?
You can't make that argument now. At the point we're at now, that's not an argument.
Why not? Labor's in government. I mean, that's the job of the Prime Minister, isn't it, to lead the nation's debate on something like this?
Because we've got a situation where the High Court has knocked out both the solution being put forward by the party in government and the party seeking to be in government. So now's the time
to say, OK, let's get serious about this and put it in context.
Possibly, but we still need to deal with offshore processing. We have a whole bunch of people who are not certain where they're going to be processed. We have a government who's got a stated policy and a right to see that policy enacted. And I'm not suggesting that we will get rid of all offshore processing, but I do think we need to start reclaiming this ground and reclaiming it as a country that is compassionate, and put the numbers in context. Can I just make this point? There are, at any given time in Australia, 50,000 visa overstayers in Australia. 80% of them are of a working age. As a party interested in the working people, perhaps that's something we should be spending time as a party and a nation focusing on. A bit more than 6,000 desperate people who have Well, no, 6,000 people who 84% of them are found to be genuine refugees.
Mitch Fifield, why do we care so much about those who come by boat?
Well, Australians have a sense of justice. They don't like the concept of people who have the means, people who have the money, moving ahead of those who might be in refugee camps, who are unable to avail themselves of people smugglers. So Australians have a strong sense of justice. But I think what we've heard here tonight already between Tanya and Christina is the problem the Labor Party has. They're divided. They don't have a border protection policy. They don't have an asylum seeker policy. We've been talking about offshore processing, but that is only one element of the solution.
Right, but if you need to deter people coming, look, there are obviously some good reasons why you do need to do that. For the control of borders reason that you argue, the safety issue about the dangerous journey, they take in some other arguments that we might get into that have been coming out of the bureaucracy as well about social breakdown. If you do need to deter boat arrivals, is Nauru really going to do that, given everyone now knows that most people who went there wound up in Australia?
Well, it wasn't most people. I think
it was 95%
of
people who are refugees. There was 95% of people who were refugees.
95% of people were found to be refugees, but not 95% of people sent to Nauru.
Correct.
That's right.
There's different apples and oranges.
Yeah.
Of the number that was sent there, though, it wasn't 95% that wound up in Australia.
No, but that's the important figure. 95% of people who are found to be refugees ended up in Australia or New Zealand.
Yes,
so
but that wasn't actually the question, which is actually what matters.
Yeah, either way, a lot of people wound up in Australia. How is Nauru, given that, going to be a deterrent now?
Well, we've never said that Nauru, or Manus Island for that matter, are the complete solution. You've also got to have temporary protection visas. You also have to have a policy where, if it's safe to do so, you turn back the boats. Now, those three elements together, when we're in office, basically saw the people smugglers.
But you can't turn back the boats now. Indonesia is not going to play ball with that anymore. Remember the port of Merak and the Oceanic Viking? Indonesia said, no, we're not taking boats back anymore.
Well, it's part of the solution, and you only do that where that's safe. But look,
you need Indonesia to play ball.
You didn't ever do it either, did you, in government?
Yeah, there were about 6 or 7 boats that were turned back in 2001, but Indonesia turned a blind eye at the time. Now they're not doing that.
But also what is important is a government's resolve and a government's language. This government has shown that it doesn't have the resolve. They raised the white flag shortly after they came into office.
Tim Wilson, let's bring you in here. What do you think about the differences between Nauru and Malaysia?
Well, look, I mean, they're both solutions that have been put forward by governments at the time. What we ultimately need now is actually some sort of, I won't say bipartisan consensus, but a recognition about the fact that neither side is going to get neither side is going to get absolutely what they want in this politically, based on both the short and the longer term outcomes. And you know, Labor and the government have been very happy to deal with their political opponents, the Greens, to give them a carbon tax. On this particular one, maybe they need to look at giving some leeway to have a proper discussion with the opposition about it, because you know, it's a complex area of public policy, and there's not going to be one of these.
There's no easy answers. Exactly, there is no easy answer. But do you think, on this point of Nauru, do you think it's a deterrent still? I mean, given the numbers that everyone knows, and people smugglers are certainly selling this argument that if you go to Nauru, it's the same as Christmas Island.
Well, I actually think the bigger problem, and this comes in if you want to try and turn back the boats, as Mitch is arguing, is countries know that the government here is weak. When the government is weak and doesn't have a level of strength, as a consequence, you can try things on. And this is the same situation that occurred in Malaysia. In the end, the Malaysian...
So Julia Gillard standing in the polls is attracting asylum seekers, is that...
No, I'm not saying attracting asylum seekers. I'm saying in terms of the way other governments behave towards our government. The deal that was negotiated with Malaysia in the end was ultimately... The Malaysian government... I was in Malaysia when it was first announced, and it was abundantly clear from the people I was talking to in Malaysia, including government officials, that they knew they had our government completely over the barrel.
They got a pretty good deal.
They had to do, the Australian government had to do basically whatever Malaysia wanted, and that's the outcome we got. And as a consequence, this is having an impact in terms of the effectiveness of the policy put forward by the government.
It's important to remember that Mitch says that he wants to take more people from refugee camps, and that's what the Australian government's proposing to do. And it's also important to remember that Tony Abbott told the Independents he was prepared to double the humanitarian intake if only they would vote for him for Prime Minister.
So it's...
Yeah.
But there is actually a point, though. It's actually about the process in doing so, and that's what this entire debate is about. I don't think there's anybody in either of the mainstream parties who's actually arguing that we shouldn't accept asylum seekers when they go through the proper processes because we do have an obligation. I actually think that's a shared view on the left and the right, broadly speaking. The issue is the process. So saying you can have increased numbers actually has no effect on the debate.
But we are dancing around the issue here. We're talking about, is Nauru really a deterrent? Well, the reason it's a deterrent is because Malaysian solution never eventuated. The East Timor solution never eventuated. Nauru will be a real deterrent because it's something deterrent because it's something that can actually get off the ground. It's something that can actually happen.
The Liberal Party has the chance now to back the Prime Minister to pass legislation that would allow the Malaysian solution to come into effect.
But where is the evidence that the Malaysian solution will actually be the wonderful deterrent the government thinks it will be either?
Well, I think many people would say that even with the announcement of that, there was a slowing in the number of arrivals. So even without the legislation enacted, there was some difference in the number of people boarding boats, and the intelligence that we get is that it was something that people smugglers were taking into account.
Well, the boats still kept coming, but we have offered. We are happy to discuss, but the ball is really in the government's court. They've got to put a proposal to us to consider.
Another big difference between Nauru and Malaysia is who processes the asylum seekers. Now, in Nauru, they're processed by Australia.
Correct.
They therefore have access to Australian Court Appeal, don't they? The highest court for Nauru is the Australian High Court. In Malaysia, they're processed by the UNHCR. They have no access to the Australian court system. That's a pretty important difference, isn't it, given the sort of challenge that we've seen succeed in the High Court?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that we are not against asylum seekers eventually coming to Australia if they are assessed as being genuine refugees. This isn't about stopping everyone from coming to Australia.
But it's about sending a message of deterrence, isn't it?
It's about sending a message of deterrence, but it's also about putting in place offshore processing, which has been proven to work.
So what's the objection to Malaysia then?
Well, Malaysia is not subject to the same sort of safeguards that Nauru is. We can control the facts on the ground in Nauru because we're actually the ones running the process.
You want to send boats back to Indonesia, don't you? That's part of your policy, you said. You want to send boats back to Indonesia, but you're worried about Malaysia. How does that work?
Where it's safe to do so. We're not hanging everything on a single element.
Indonesia's not a signatory to the convention either.
And you're worried about people's safety, but you want to turn the boats around and send them back to Indonesia.
Well, our prime objective is to stop the boats coming in the first place. And that's what happened when we're in office.
I think it's a striking contradiction.
We sit here and we talk about Nauru and we talk about Malaysia and whether it sends a deterrent, but if you look at the figures, I think it was in 1999, it was the first time boat arrivals tipped over air arrivals. And since that time, the trend has been that as global numbers of asylum seekers increased, they increased in Australia. And as when they went down, globally, they went down in Australia. And in fact, you're wrong on TPVs. When they came in, that did not have a deterrent effect. In fact, you saw an increase. So, I mean, we can sit here and go back and forth.
It made women and kids get on boats.
That's not correct, Christina. It doesn't matter how many times people in the Labor Party say the number of boats increased after TPVs. It is not true.
It made women and kids get on boats too.
Well, we know boat numbers increased last year, which led the government to look for some of these offshore options. At the end of the day, what does Labor do, Tanya Plibersek, if the coalition won't support changes to the Migration Act to revive Malaysia?
Well, I think we need to put legislation in the Parliament and
but it'll fail. It'll fail.
Well, we yet to see that. We'll have to say that the opposition are saying that they're keen to find a solution to this, that they're keen to be bipartisan.
Yeah, but they're also saying no to Malaysia. So do you guys go with their option of Nauru?
Well, I think that Tony Abbott has to really think hard about whether he's prepared to say vote no in the Parliament.
Well, presumably
legislation that will enable not just the processing in Malaysia, but enable what he says he wants in the future, which is Nauru and Manus Island, which are also ruled out according to the legal advice we have.
He says he's happy to support that,
but not necessarily so.
But not Malaysia.
Well, according to the legal advice we have, this casts doubt on all offshore processing. So Tony Abbott,
not according to the judgment itself.
Well, according to the legal advice we have, this cast doubt on all offshore processing.
The legal advice prepared by the same people who said it was all legal in the first place.
So
that would be a yes.
Well,
can I just ask, though, in terms of, I mean, it always fascinates me, at every point throughout this debate, the government has said no to Nauru. Has come up with every single other option possible that they could find, any configuration around most of Southeast Asia that was viable for a possible negotiation. What is wrong with Nauru, apart from recognising that it was a policy of the former Howard government?
Well, that it's not much of a deterrent because 95% of people end up here, that it's expensive, that there's no support services, there's no support services.
What in comparison to what they'll get in Malaysia?
It's, well, we've negotiated an arrangement with the Malaysian government which gives us a high degree of confidence that people will be allowed to work, that the kids will be able to receive an education.
High degree of confidence means that you're...
A high degree of confidence. We've been given assurances that people will be treated with dignity, and I think...
That's not certainty. But there is actually a very significant, important difference, because if you're... it's not. It's actually in terms of...
I don't know if I'll be alive tomorrow. Well, we've been given guarantees by the Malaysian government. Are you saying that they are lying to us? What are you suggesting?
Well, I'm not suggesting the Solicitor General was lying to you about legal advice either, but the reality is these people are effectively in our care under the government when they're processed, and human rights do matter. And actually taking care of them does matter. And I'm actually, as someone who actually supports having asylum seekers properly processed, the idea that we're setting to a place where we're handing them to a government we don't actually have the certainty we need about making sure that people are technically considering the record that's occurred in terms of human rights violations.
But turning the boats around and sending them back to Indonesia, that's okay.
But that has equal issues. That has equal issues, but that doesn't obfuscate your responsibility to answer the question.
Let me get to the fundamental point that you're suggesting here. Are you saying we should be processing them all onshore? If you're that concerned about the guarantee, do you agree with the Greens that they should all be processed here?
No, I think we should look at all options, because I'm not actually sure what the answer is, and I don't pretend to know.
I think we should look at all options.
No, but I don't actually believe that there is a silver bullet to this issue, because there are multiple, both in the short and the long term, to solving this problem, options of how you can actually deal with it. But what we know is that the current situation isn't viable, and we need to find a short-term political solution. Then we need to deal with it in a longer-term sense. But we don't have those on the table. And this is where it requires the government has to actually negotiate successfully with the opposition.
The one thing we can all agree on is there's no easy answers to this. Just on a process question, should caucus get a fair debate on this before any decision from the government?
I'm sure that there will be discussions within caucus. But
before or after the decision?
Well, I'm sure there will be discussions within caucus. Parliament's sitting next week. Yeah. I'm sure that my colleagues will discuss this. But
so there won't be an announcement from the PM before then as to what you're going to do?
Well, I'm sure that we will discuss it next week. But Tim's saying that we need to have a longer-term solution, and I think that a regional processing framework, which Malaysia was the first step towards, is part of that solution. The idea that people have an equal claim to be resettled in a third country, and if they get processed in Malaysia or in Indonesia or in PNG or in Australia, the strength of their claim determines how quickly they're resettled. It's something that we should be working towards.
On a related issue, the Immigration Department's been briefing both sides of politics about the dangers of just reverting to onshore processing alone, saying this is going to lead to a flood of boats arriving, it's going to lead to people turning against multiculturalism in Australia, and even the sort of social breakdown and rioting that we've witnessed in London and Paris. Does anyone buy that?
Sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it?
And they didn't say that to the opposition in the briefing. It appears that they told that to the press after the briefing, but that's not something that the Department of Immigration shared with us. And, you know, I think we've got to come back to the fact that it doesn't have to be this hard. The government is making this much more difficult than it needs to be. They're looking for every alternative solution under the sun, other than the one which has already been in place and which worked and which stopped the boats. I mean, you know, we thought that at home with Well, it's easier than you guys are making it. You know, we thought that At Home with Julia was a farce, nothing compared to Away with Julia, where she was basically hiding behind
You've been
pot
waiting all night
plants.
to use that line, have you?
Hiding behind pot plants to avoid seeing the president of Nauru.
We might move
that's
on.
the reality.
Yeah.
After the break, what's been another trouble spot for the government, the Craig Thompson issue. Finally, New South Wales Police have said they're not going to investigate. Stay with us.